Welcome back to the 6Bs podcast. Today we are going to continue reading through Fred de Guiar's novella, The Longest Memory, with chapter 12 to feature today. Let's run through a quick summary first. And once again, we've got a perspective change. This chapter is told from one of Whitechapel's great-granddaughters, and it almost reads like a bit of a memoir. So we've got a different style once again. She's sort of recounting experiences from her past. So this is, I guess, reflects the general view of the other enslaved persons on the plantation in regards to Chapel's death and their response to it. Now, she recalls her experiences with her great-grandfather, Whitechapel, and the lessons he passed on, along with her dreams of almost, I guess, returning to Africa and the connection she holds there. However, she also recounts Chapel's death and Whitechapel's last days. She notes how this incident has permanently scarred him, how he's been, I guess, ousted or treated as an outcast by his family because of his betrayal, and how this has destroyed all hope for Africa. Chapter 12, Great-Grandmother, or more than likely it should actually read Great-Granddaughter. New England lice bite harder than African lice. He dropped this in his little talks with me as he supervised my wash. Do behind your ears, I hear him say. Now under your arms. Use plenty of water. Good girl. You'll grow up to be beautiful and strong. Now between your legs. More water. There's more where that came from. He made me fetch the water for my wash with a bucket in each arm. A clean child is closer to God than a dirty one. Another one of his sayings. I asked him what African lice looked like and how New England lice managed to get all the way to Virginia. He said he left Africa when he was a boy. One day, he was playing in a field of tall grass. The smell comes back to him all these years later, unannounced. The next, he was marching. Several days after that, he was facing the sea for a journey he thought would never end, and one that claimed many lives, young and adult. No one lifted a finger to help a 10-year-old boy. Women and men were like children in the hands of those who held them captive. And the lice? The lice in Africa do not bite, they tickle. Children like being tickled, so they carry lice on them. If they do not have any, they hunt for some. Without African lice on their bodies, they are sad. New England lice, by contrast, have teeth. They bite pieces out of you and drain your blood for sustenance. If I washed with plenty of water, I'd keep them away. He stopped supervising my washes when he asked me to scrub my chest, and I told him my nipples hurt. Go wash with the women. But I wanted him to be there. He was African great-grandfather to me. I told him I had a dream about Africa. He said, between supervising which part of my body I should next wash, what did I want to go and do something silly like dreaming about Africa for? I had plenty of water left, and my knees, elbows, and feet still to scrub, so I told him my dream anyway. I fly through the air and land in a place I know is Africa. The first thing I do is kiss the ground. I get down on all fours and kiss the soil or sand which feels like something I could eat and not get a bellyache. My kiss is not a peck or a brush of the lips, but a full mouth kiss so that when I rise, there is a ring of soil applied to my lips, and I don't care about it. That's how I know I'm back where I belong. I shade my eyes from the moonlight, turn sunlight, without warning and duck into a hut just as bright with firelight. I stay inside in that glare, even though it forces me to hold a salute over my eyes, first with my left and then with my right hand. I soon grow accustomed to the brightness and make out the figures of family and friends slapping me on the back, squeezing my hands as if to wring water from them, and kissing me on the mouth in such quick succession, I pant for air, which the repeated slaps on the back and bear hugs squash out of me. A pot on the fire in the centre of the hut gives off a smell of pepper and spices that turn my mouth into a spring. Where people once stood, they sit, ready to eat. I'll have to swallow every few seconds to stop myself from dribbling over the contents of this pot. A steaming heaped clay plate is thrust into my grip, and I am pushed from my feet to the ground. Everyone motions for me to eat. They don't take from this glorious pot, but stop to watch me. I think it may be some potion that will turn my head and leave me helpless and in their clutches, but I don't worry about that thought. I scoop up a handful of something that resembles rice and a meat I don't recognise. I taste sweet, sour, salt rolled into one. A big cheer from everyone threatens to lift the roof off the hut. Someone next to me holds up my left hand, the hand I do everything with, and says, "This is indeed the great-grandchild of our son." I realise they mean you, grandfather, your left-handedness that nearly all of us have inherited. The room begins to spin. Flames under the pot lose their shape. Heat all over me makes me feel as if I'd taken the place of that sweet and sour pot above those flames. My grip loosens on the plate, spilling the meat and rice into my lap. I jump up and I'm awake shouting. I'm the third grandchild of his 12th daughter, his youngest great-grandchild. "Africa is not for you," was all he said in response. I asked why. He poured the last of the water over me. He signalled for me to leave. I did not do my usual dance of rubbing all over my body in a hurry. I stood there shivering in the dusk. He looked at me with his raised eyebrows as if to say, "Are you challenging me, girl?" I looked at my toes, burrowing into the ground that I wanted to open and close over me, yet I stayed rooted there waiting for him to say something. At last he impatiently replied, "Because you don't recognise the food." He flicked me that look of, "Get out of my sight, girl," but I returned him knitted brows. He read my puzzlement. "You dream about something you don't know. Make your dreams here." He was annoyed with me for dreaming. Well, I didn't like what he had to say. He never talked about Africa. It was his view, I found out later, that such talk promoted daydreams and insolence on the plantation. He said Africa was his past and not ours. If anyone had the right to dream about it, he did, and he chose not to, so why should anyone else? He always said "great" when I called him Grandad, but so quiet I would just catch it. I stopped calling him Grandad to stop him saying "great" every time. The few occasions I forgot and called his name, he had his great ready for me. He had married again after years on his own. His son was younger than I. As a matter of fact, his wife was younger than my oldest sister. But she acted older, and for a while made Grandad sprightly again and brought back his smile. Her death took away his smile, turned down his mouth. His son's death deadened his eyes, and because he caused that death, we all run from him, except my brother, who ran into him and has a permanent swelling on his forehead as a result of the collision. No one speaks to him or smiles at him, except me, sometimes. When I walk past him, in a wide arc, he sits down. It makes me laugh. I fight back the laugh, but it shakes my body. He is a ghost we all see and ignore because he killed his only son. When his son was missing, a great conference began about what would happen and what could be done. Grandfather announced his intention to tell the master where his son had gone. He said it would bring him back in one piece. I and everyone else failed to see how betraying his son's whereabouts to the master he'd escaped could be construed as a protective act. Everyone, without exception, thought the old man had finally taken leave of his senses. He held up his hand and said each of our names. He said there were things he knew which he could not impart to anyone. There were calls of, "What things? What things?" His final plea was for us to trust him in this decision concerning his son, whose well-being was uppermost in his mind. With that he turned from us, and we parted like the sea for him. There was some talk of restraining him as he strode towards the big house, as if he owned the key to the front door, but no one moved. Everyone was ordered to the yard. We were all eager to go, not to watch a beating that should not be happening in the first place, but to see the face of the old man who made it possible. He behaved as if the whole incident was a surprise. I saw how the whip exacted as much of a toll on his aged body as his son's. From that day, I could do nothing for him. I smiled. I called him names, but I could do nothing for him. I had seen and felt the result of his actions. One of us was absent because of him. He shrank in stature before my eyes. From his habit of sitting down unaccountably, It was clear any manner of attention had become better than none at all. I wanted to fetch his water for him and help him bathe. My dream about Africa? Gone. Banished to the place where dreams retreat when they are ridiculed. In its place are nightmares of a beating that never ends. It wakes me. The whip keeps a slow time beaten on a man's back. The man is quiet, so quiet, I peer to see if he is living through what is happening to him as much as me. His mouth hardly grimaces. His eyes are like his father's would become from that day, still, dark, and detached from his body. His mouth responds to the whip, as does his body, contracting with each lash, then relaxing from exhaustion. I see from his eyes that he is absent from himself, long before the end. That is good. What form of reasoning could have convinced grandfather that his son would be safe? I've wanted to ask him every day since, imagining I could defy the band to speak to him, and be damned myself because what grandfather would tell me would be infallible. But all I did was call him sit down grandfather, see him mouth the great I always leave out, and dream about helping him with his bucket in the walk up the hill from the well, and pouring the last of the water on him, so that he could use both hands to rub himself all over. His body is stiff. He lies half curled. His skin is already cold. I start at his head, his face, neck, and behind his ears, wiping the slack skin in his neck to catch a streak of water, wiping the set creases at the corners of his mouth. Then his hands. I uncurl the fingers which have the resistance of the dead in them and wipe the palms with their pathways of an ant's nest. His knuckles are round as stones. His nails are as dark brown as his skin. I cannot carry on. I'm led from the room, and the ablutions are continued by another of his great-grandchildren. It would have been easier to fetch his water and pour on him, leaning forward on the balls of my feet, to avoid the windmills of his arms and the spray. So let's look at some key quotations from this particular chapter. The first one, you'll dream about something you don't know. Make your dreams here. He said Africa was his past and not ours. This is another quotation which really reflects Whitechapel's views about being thankful for their position in society. I've mentioned there this idea about dreams and hope, and how Whitechapel maintains his stance that an enslaved person should focus on the present and not on the future. And we know, of course, that this is where he differed from his son, and perhaps this is the reasoning behind why he turned Whitechapel in. The second quotation, here's a ghost we all see and ignore because he killed his own son. Once again, we've got a metaphor being used to highlight the impact of Chapel's death and the impact in general of trauma, of grief and of guilt that he feels for what happened to Chapel. Note the wording, there's a few phrases in here, but this phrasing in particular, he killed his only son. You can sort of see here how blame falls on him. And this chapter is really, the second part of it, all about how the other family members respond to his actions, how they shut him out and treat him like an outsider for what he did to his son. And they mention the word betrayal. They definitely see his actions as being that of a betrayer. The last quote you can look at here is good because it relates to one of our key symbols, being the whip. I saw how the whip exacted as much of a toll on his body than his son's. What's interesting about this, obviously, is we see the whip being personified in the other chapters, particularly when it comes to Chapel's death. But here we can see that the whip causes pain far beyond the victim and has long-lasting consequences. And of course, this chapter also outlines Whitechapel's final days and his death. We'll finish off by making some connections to the 7 stages of grieving. These are really broad, I must say. The first one, we've talked about it before, shame and guilt. Whitechapel's guilt is reflective of that faced by the father in the 7 stages of grieving. Perhaps it's a little bit different in terms of why they feel guilt or why they feel shame, but it's definitely there. You could also look at how an individual can be treated as an outcast and the reasoning behind that. So obviously The outsider in the 7 stages of grieving that you could look at would be the auntie. When it comes to memory, obviously consider the pain caused by death and how individuals try to forget the past, and you can look at things from the 7 stages of grieving like photographs and like the suitcase, and you could look at memory from this text anyway. From the longest memory could be the descriptions of Whitechapel's physicality, his face and his body, particularly after his death. And family, the importance of passing on traditions to younger generations. And you could look at the differences or similarities here, I guess, as well, both the positive traditions that are passed on and maybe the older ones and the more traditional views that are passed on to future generations. And something you can look at as well, I guess, is the endings and the sense of hope, and I guess the varying sense of hope that is explored in both texts. But I think we'll leave it there for now. We've only got one chapter and an epilogue to go before we finish this text.